The morning Harlan Voss grabbed Mabel Ashcroft's travel bag off the porch steps and threw it into the mud in front of every man on that ranch. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about power. He looked her up and down, slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he's decided you're nothing before you've opened your mouth. Then he laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable one, a satisfied one. "You're not working here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at you. You'd eat through our winter stores before you ever finished curing them." Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. And Mabel stood there in the dirt, bag at her feet, hands steady, heart hammering, trying to decide if she was going to turn around and walk back the way she came. She didn't. And that decision changed everything. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you knew you were meant to be, stay with me. This one's for you. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you like what you hear, tap that like button. It means the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The first thing anyone noticed about Mabel Ashcroft when she stepped off the stage in Harlow Creek, Montana, was that she was large. Not large in the polite way people describe someone when they're trying not to be rude. Large in the way that made strangers stare a half second too long, the way that made men whisper to each other behind their hands, the way that made women at the dry goods counter suddenly find something very interesting to look at near the floor. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with hands that had spent more years over a smoking pit than most people twice her age. She carried a single travel bag, worn at both handles, and she walked like she wasn't particularly concerned about what anybody thought of her pace. That wasn't exactly true, of course. She was very concerned. She had simply learned, over a long and specific kind of life, to keep that part of herself somewhere private. Harlow Creek was a small town doing its level best to survive the coming winter. The storefronts were weather-stripped and patched. The main road ran with a shallow rut from wagon traffic, and the smell of wood smoke and manure and dried leather hung over everything like a permanent condition. It was the kind of town that had never been pretty and had given up trying. Mabel didn't mind that. She hadn't come for pretty. She'd come because a posted notice at the last stage stop in Billings had said, in plain ink on a rain-spotted paper, "Smokehouse operator needed. Mercer Ranch, Harlow Creek. Experience required. Inquire directly." She'd stood in front of that notice for a long time. Long enough that the man behind the postal counter had cleared his throat twice. Then she'd taken the notice down, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. The Mercer Ranch sat about 4 miles outside of Harlow Creek proper, at the end of a road that had never quite decided if it wanted to be a road. Rolling pasture on both sides, brown and flattened by October cold, with a tree line of pine cutting the horizon to the north. The main house was 2 stories, originally built to be impressive, now just tired. The smokehouse sat off to the side, squat, dark-stained, with a rusted iron pipe chimney that had gone cold. Mabel could tell it had been cold for a while. She stopped at the gate and looked at that smokehouse for a long moment before she pushed through. The yard was where she first met Harlan Voss. He was the ranch's head hand, or at least he held the title, which is a different thing entirely. He was 43, lean in the way of a man who ate enough but worked little, with narrow eyes and a mustache he maintained with more care than he gave most people. He was standing near the water trough when she came through the gate, and he turned around and looked at her, and his face did the thing faces do when the person in front of them doesn't match the picture in their head. "Help you?" he said. "Not can I help you, just help you." Flat, like a door already half closed. "I'm here about the smokehouse position," Mabel said. "Posted notice out of Billings." Harlan looked at her bag. He looked at her coat. He looked at her, the whole of her, the way she had been let 1,000 times before, slowly, assessing, and then deciding. "That position's for someone who can work," he said. She let that sit in the air between them. "I can work," she said. "It's heavy work, early starts and late finishes. Not exactly," he gestured with one hand, vague and contemptible at once, "a sitting job." "I know what a smokehouse job is," she said. "I've been doing it since I was 11 years old." The group of ranch hands who drifted near, there were 4 of them, working or pretending to near the fence line, were all paying attention now, the kind of attention that feels like a held breath before someone laughs. Harlan stepped forward, picked up her travel bag from where she'd set it at her feet, and threw it into the mud at the edge of the yard. Not far. Just far enough. "You're not working here," he said. "Volume up." Making sure the four men near the fence heard every word. "Look at you. You'd eat through our winter stores before you ever finished curing them." One of the men by the fence snorted. Another turned away so his smile wouldn't show, though it did, anyway. Mabel looked at her bag in the mud. She looked at Harlan. She breathed in once through her nose, which was a thing she had learned to do when what she wanted to do was something entirely different. She picked up her bag herself. "Is the owner here?" she said. "Owner's not interested in... Is the owner here?" It wasn't a question the second time. Harlan heard the difference and didn't like it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like a man deciding whether to double down or step aside. He chose something between the two. He turned and walked toward the main house without another word, which she took as a yes. She followed him, mud on her boot tips, bag in hand. Well, Rowan Mercer was in the kitchen when Harlan came through the back door, and he had the particular look of a man who hadn't slept a full night in several weeks. He was 41, not old, but aging in the deliberate way that hard winters and harder decisions will age a man. He had a coffee cup he kept touching without drinking from, and papers spread across the table that he clearly wasn't looking at anymore. He looked up when Harlan came in. He looked past Harlan to Mabel, standing in his doorway with her bag and her muddy boots, and her expression that was carefully, precisely, giving away nothing. "She says she's here about the smokehouse," Harlan said. He said it the way you'd report something mildly absurd. Rowan looked at her. Not the way Harlan had looked at her. Not that slow assessment of everything that was wrong with the picture. He looked at her the way a tired man looks at something he isn't sure about yet. "You have experience?" he said. "My father ran a smokehouse in Kentucky for 22 years, Mabel said. "I worked it with him from age 11 until he passed last spring. Salt cures, sugar cures, smoke timing for beef, pork, venison, and fowl. I know how to stretch a cure across a short season, and I know how to read a fire well enough that I don't lose a batch to heat spike or smoke drop. I'm also good at inventory, and I don't waste." Rowan looked at her for a long beat. "The smokehouse has been cold since August," he said. Previous man walked off. "We're heading into November with nothing cured and..." He stopped, started again. "It's not a good situation." "I can see that," she said. Harlan made a sound from somewhere near the counter, not quite a word. "I'd want one condition," Mabel said. Rowan's eyes shifted slightly. "What kind of condition?" "I run the smokehouse my way. No one overrides my decisions on process, timing, or fire management. I'll report directly to you on quantities and schedule. But inside that building, what I say goes." Harlan actually laughed at that. A short, disbelieving sound. Rowan didn't laugh. He looked at her for what felt, to Mabel, like a very long time. She kept her face even. She was practiced at keeping her face even. Then he reached into his pocket and set a small iron key on the table between them. "Meals are at 6 and 7, he said. "Bunkhouse has a spare corner you can use." He didn't say you're hired. He didn't say welcome. He just pushed the key a half-inch toward her and looked back down at his papers. Mabel picked up the key. The smokehouse had been neglected in the intimate, total way that only happens when the person responsible for something simply stops caring. The racks were filmed with old grease and ash residue. The firebox needed new claywork on one side. The wood supply was low and badly stacked against moisture, which meant it would burn hot and fast and wrong. The salt stores were adequate but not organized. Bags open, some spilled, humidity getting in. Mabel stood inside that dark little building for about 10 minutes before she came back out. The ranch hands were doing chores around the yard. She could feel them watching her from their peripheral vision. That particular kind of watching that pretends not to be watching. One of them, a younger man, maybe 20, with a red kerchief and the easy confidence of someone who hasn't been wrong enough times yet, said, loud enough for the others to hear, "Didn't last long in there. I need clay, dry kindling, and whoever stacked that woodpile to come pull it apart and restack it away from the east wall," Mabel said, not to the young man in particular, not to anyone in particular. "Also, I need the salt bags brought inside and covered properly. They're taking on moisture." Nobody moved. She looked up. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you what the ranch needs done. Whether you do it or whether you tell Mr. Mercer that you'd rather let the winter stores rot because you don't feel like taking direction from me, that's a conversation you're welcome to have with him. The young one with the red kerchief opened his mouth. "What's your name?" she said. He blinked. "Cal. Cal, have you ever watched a full curing batch fail because the salt absorbed ambient moisture for 2 weeks before anyone thought to cover it?" Cal had not. "Then you'd rather not see it," she said. "Trust me." He looked at the others. The others looked at each other. Then, slowly, grudgingly, in the way that men sometimes do when they don't want to admit that a reasonable argument is reasonable, they started moving. Mabel went back inside the smokehouse. She didn't smile. There was nothing to smile about yet, but something settled in her chest, some small, compressed thing that had been tight all day. She was in. She had the key. She had the work. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The first 3 days were quiet in the wrong way. Not the quiet of acceptance, the quiet of waiting. The men did what she asked, but they did it at a half step, with a specific kind of slowness that said, "We're doing this, but we're not doing it for you." Meals were taken separately. Nobody came to the smokehouse unless she sent word. When she walked across the yard, conversations didn't exactly stop, but they thinned. She'd been in towns like this before, situations like this before. She knew the texture of being tolerated without being welcomed. She worked anyway. She rebuilt the firebox clay over the first afternoon, doing it herself because asking for help with that particular task would have resulted in it being done wrong on purpose. She'd seen that kind before too. She restacked the wood. She organized the salt in graded portions by weight and cure type, the way her father had taught her, the way his father had taught him. A system that looked like fussiness to anyone who didn't understand it, and looked like genius once the winter set in and not a single piece of meat came out undercured or over brine. On the 4th day, she started the first cure. Pork bellies, 14 of them, from the hogs they'd slaughtered before she arrived. The previous hand had left notes, useless, wrong notes, the kind of notes a man writes when he's guessing and doesn't want anyone to know. She set them aside. She worked by what she knew: salt, sugar, a specific proportion her father had refined over 15 winters. Smoke timing adjusted for the altitude here, which was higher than Kentucky, a detail that changed burn rate and smoke density in ways that mattered, ways that an inexperienced curer would miss, ways that would result in meat that tasted off without the eater being able to say exactly why. She stayed in the smokehouse past midnight on the first day of curing, not because she had to, because she wanted to be certain. Around 2 in the morning, Rowan came to the door. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway, looking at the fire she'd built low and steady, at the carefully spaced bellies on the rack, at her sitting on a stool she'd brought from the corner with a cup of cold coffee going untouched beside her. "You need anything?" he said. It surprised her. She hadn't expected that. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded. He stood there another moment, then, "I should have asked your name, before, when you came to the door." Mabel looked at him. Mabel Ashcroft. Rowan Mercer. He said it like they were meeting for the first time, which, in the way that mattered, they were. He paused. "I'm sorry about Harlan." She didn't say it's fine because it wasn't fine, and they both knew it, and she'd learned a long time ago that saying something was fine when it wasn't did a particular kind of damage to a person over time, accumulated and compounding. "He works for you," she said instead. "How he acts reflects on what you allow." Rowan absorbed that without flinching. She'd half expected defensiveness. There wasn't any. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He left. She fed the fire another small log, exactly the right size, and watched the smoke bloom even and clean above the rack. Outside the smokehouse walls, the first real cold of November pressed down on Harlow Creek, Montana. The temperature dropped 6 degrees between midnight and 3 in the morning. The wind came out of the north with intent, and Mabel Ashcroft sat with her fire and her meat and her dead father's knowledge and kept everything alive. The morning of the 8th day, she pulled the first finished ham off the rack. She'd planned to simply log it into inventory and say nothing dramatic about it. She had not planned for Rowan to be standing in the yard when she carried it out, and she had not planned for Harlan and Cal and the other 2 hands to be nearby, and she had not planned, though looking back she should have expected it, for Harlan to say what he said. Hope it doesn't taste like it was made by someone who ate half of it on the way out, he said. Two of the men laughed. Cal had the grace to look at his boots. Mabel set the ham down on the split-rail fence. She took out her knife, the same short-bladed knife her father had given her when she was 12, and she cut 4 clean slices without a word. She held the plate toward Harlan first. He looked at it. He looked at her. Then, because refusing would have made him look afraid, and he couldn't allow that, he took a slice. He ate it. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not a movie moment, just something closed and something else, unwillingly, opened. He didn't say anything. Mabel moved to Cal, who took a piece without the theatrics, chewed it, and went very still for a moment. "That's—" Cal started. "Yeah," said the man next to him, who'd already helped himself. Rowan took the last slice. He stood there in the cold morning air and ate it and looked out toward the mountains to the north. And when he looked back at Mabel, his expression was something she recognized from long experience, a man encountering the distance between what he assumed and what turned out to be true. Harlan had walked away. He didn't say anything else that morning, and he didn't look at her directly for the rest of the day. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. And Mabel had learned, over 26 years and considerable evidence, that something was sometimes all you got, and you had to decide whether something was enough to keep going on. She picked up the plate, went back into the smokehouse, and started on the next batch. She kept going. The second batch of hams came out 3 days after the first, and by then word had moved through the ranch the way word moves in small, closed places. Not announced, just known. Nobody said anything directly to Mabel about the first ham. That wasn't how it worked out here. You didn't walk up to someone and say, "I was wrong about you," because that required admitting you'd been wrong. And most people preferred to simply adjust their behavior without the admission. Cal started stacking the firewood properly without being asked a second time. The older hand, a quiet man named Dex, who'd been on the Mercer Ranch for 11 years and had the particular stillness of someone who observed everything and commented on very little, started leaving the morning's water barrel closer to the smokehouse door. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean anything individually and mean everything collectively. Harlan noticed. He didn't like it. He didn't say anything overt about the second batch, or the third. He watched from a distance, which was its own kind of message. "I'm not going to help you fail, but I'm waiting for you to fail on your own." Mabel had encountered that particular brand of opposition before. It was in some ways harder to deal with than open hostility, because there was nothing to push back against. It just sat there in the air, patient and heavy. She kept working. By the second week of November, she had established a rhythm that the smokehouse hadn't seen in years. She rose before dawn, banked the overnight fire if she'd left one running, checked the humidity and the temperature inside the building by feel and by the way the smoke moved, a thing her father had spent years teaching her and which she could not fully explain to anyone who hadn't grown up with the same education. The smoke should move like water, he used to say, slow and even, finding its level. When it eddies or spikes, something is wrong. She checked her racks. She checked her salt ratios. She kept a small ledger in her coat pocket, entries in her own compressed handwriting, quantities and dates and observations. The kind of record-keeping that looked like obsession to anyone who didn't understand that in a frontier smokehouse in November, the difference between careful and careless was the difference between a ranch that made it through winter and one that didn't. Rowan came by in the evenings sometimes. Not every evening. He'd stand in the doorway. He hadn't come inside again since that first night, though she couldn't have said exactly why that was, whether it was respect for her stated autonomy over the space or something more complicated. And he'd ask about quantities, about the schedule, about what she'd need for the next week. She gave him straight answers. He received them without commentary. They were not, by any reasonable definition, having conversations. But they were talking, which was more than they'd managed the first few days, and Mabel understood that to be progress. The problem with Harlan came to a head on a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because she kept close track of days in November, the way you keep close track of steps when you're crossing ice. Not because any individual day matters, but because losing count means losing your place, and losing your place out here had consequences. She'd been inside the smokehouse since 5 in the morning, tending the final stage of a venison cure that required specific timing. The smoke had to run clean at a lower temperature for the last 6 hours, which meant feeding the fire small and precise, not letting it climb. It was painstaking, and it was boring, and it was important, and she'd told Cal the previous evening to make sure no one came in to adjust the vents before she signaled it was done. She came out at noon to get water. The vent on the south side of the smokehouse had been opened, all the way. The fire temperature would have climbed in the past hour. She looked at it, felt what was happening in her chest. Not quite panic, something older and angrier than panic, and went inside to assess. The venison wasn't ruined. She had caught it in time, barely, by minutes maybe. She brought the fire back down and stood there in the smoke-thick air with her jaw set and her hands doing the work automatically, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. When she came out, Harlan was at the fence. Not close, not obviously watching, just there. She walked toward him, which she hadn't planned to do. Her legs simply went in that direction. "Did you touch the south vent?" she said. Harlan turned around with the particular unhurried motion of a man who'd decided he wasn't going to be caught off balance. "Temperature gauges don't belong to you," he said. "Ranch operations are my responsibility. I told Cal to leave the vents alone until I said otherwise. Cal works for the ranch, not for you." She looked at him. He looked at her. The air between them was that particular temperature of a disagreement that had already decided it wasn't going to be resolved by talking. "If that venison had turned," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something, "we'd have lost 14 days of cure work and approximately 60 pounds of winter meat. You understand what 60 pounds means to this ranch right now?" "I understand that a smokehouse vent isn't your personal property." "You're right," she said. "It's Rowan's property, and Rowan gave me authority over how this smokehouse is operated. So if you have a problem with that, take it to Rowan." She turned around and went back inside. She was shaking slightly, which she hated, not from fear, from the particular fury of being interfered with by someone who had no idea what they were interfering with and didn't care to know, and would never admit the damage they'd almost caused. She fed the fire. She did not shake for long. She couldn't afford to. Rowan heard about this vent before she could decide whether to tell him. He came to the smokehouse that evening with a different quality of attention than usual, tighter, more deliberate, the way a man carries himself when he's already decided something and is working out how to say it. "Harlan says there was a disagreement about the south vent," he said. "There was," she said. "He says he was adjusting for temperature management. He opened the vent on the final stage of a venison cure. If I hadn't been back within the hour, we'd have lost the batch." She didn't say he did it on purpose. She didn't know that. She suspected it, but suspicion wasn't the same as knowing, and she wasn't in the habit of accusing without knowing. "I'd like you to clarify the chain of authority with him." Rowan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. He looked at the racks, which were full, fuller than they'd been since September, probably fuller than they'd been last winter. "How much do we have cured so far?" he said. Not changing the subject, not exactly, just taking in the full picture before he responded to any piece of it. She opened her ledger and read him the numbers. He was quiet again. "That's," he started. He didn't finish. "It'll be enough for the ranch through February if we don't waste," she said. "Maybe March if the winter is mild. I need 3 more weeks and we'll have a buffer on top of that." 3 more weeks, he repeated. "I need to know the smokehouse is mine to run," she said. "I told you that at the beginning. I'm not asking for anything beyond what we already agreed." Rowan looked at her, and she saw something move across his face. Not quite guilt, but related to guilt, the shadow of it. "I'll talk to Harlan," he said. She nodded. She went back to her fire. She did not feel relief exactly. She felt the absence of a particular kind of dread, which was close to relief, but had a different texture. What Rowan said to Harlan she didn't know and didn't ask. What changed was this. Harlan stopped coming within 40 feet of the smokehouse. He communicated through Cal now, when he needed to communicate at all. And Cal, who had come around to something resembling cautious respect over the previous 2 weeks, delivered the messages straightforwardly and without editorial. The other change, smaller, was that Dex started staying late in the evening sometimes, just in the yard, doing small repairs or maintenance tasks that could have been done during the day. He never said he was keeping an eye out. He never said anything about it at all. But Mabel understood what it meant, and she was more grateful for it than she showed. She was not good at showing gratitude. She was aware of this. It was something she'd identified about herself without yet figuring out how to fix it. She received kindness with the same lockdown composure she received everything else. Because she'd learned from specific repeated experience that gratitude offered too openly got used against you. You showed someone you needed them, and they started deciding what that was worth. She was working on it. She was just working on it slowly. The day the merchant came was the 15th of November. His name was Gerald Pratt. He ran the dry goods and provisioning operation in Harlow Creek, and he was, in the particular way of men who have a small amount of power in a small place, deeply committed to ensuring that everyone understood that power and deferred to it appropriately. He was perhaps 50, with a fringe of gray hair and the kind of posture that says, "I have opinions and I will share them." He came to the Mercer Ranch with the delivery of additional salt that Rowan had ordered. Her request, logged in the ledger, approved without question. And when he pulled his wagon into the yard and saw Mabel carrying a rack section across the yard to the smokehouse, he did the thing she'd come to expect from men like Gerald Pratt. He stared. He looked at Rowan, who had come out to receive the delivery. He looked back at Mabel. "That's your smokehouse operator?" he said. "Yep," Rowan said. Gerald watched her for another moment. Then he made the sound. She heard it clearly, 30 feet away, in the cold, still air. A short, air-out-the-nose sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a scoff, but was designed to accomplish what both of those accomplish. "Fat woman running a smokehouse," he said, just loud enough. "Wonder how much of the inventory makes it to the rack." He said it to Rowan, but he meant it for her. She kept walking. She had the rack section and her eyes straight, and she kept moving toward the smokehouse because she had learned, at significant personal cost, that stopping was what they wanted. Stopping meant engaging, and engaging meant giving them a stage, and she refused to be anyone's entertainment. But she heard it. She heard every syllable of it. Inside the smokehouse, she set the rack section down carefully against the wall and stood with her hands on the rough wood surface and breathed. She was still standing there, back to the door, breathing, when she heard Rowan's voice outside, not raised, but carrying, in the way that quiet voices carry when they've decided something. "You want to say something about one of my people," Rowan said. "You say it to me, not where she can hear it. I know what you were doing, still quiet, still carrying. I've got the full winter stores on track for the first time in 3 years because of the woman you just insulted in my yard. So let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to unload that salt, and I'm going to pay you for it, and then you're going to get in your wagon and go back to town. And the next time you feel like making a joke at the expense of someone who works this ranch, I want you to think about whether you want my business or whether you want the joke, because you're not going to have both." Silence. Then the sound of the wagon creaking, someone climbing down, salt bags landing in the dirt, footsteps, then wheels turning. Mabel stood with her hands on the rack section and let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she'd realized. She didn't say anything to Rowan about it that evening. He didn't bring it up either. But when he stopped in the doorway at dusk, the way he'd started doing, he had the look of a man who'd done something he considered minimal and didn't want credit for it, and she thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd seen from him yet. "Inventory looks full," he said. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He left. She added 3 lines to her ledger. She fed the fire exactly what it needed. She thought about her father, which she tried not to do too often because it tended to make the work feel heavier. But she thought about him tonight, about his hands on the fire, about the particular smell of his coat at the end of a long day in the smokehouse. Wood and salt, and something underneath that was just him. And she thought, "I'm doing it right. You'd say I'm doing it right." She didn't know if that was true. She just needed it to be true for the next hour or so. That was usually enough. The 3rd week of November brought the first serious cold front. Not the deep freeze, that was still coming. Everyone on the ranch could feel it gathering at the northern horizon, like something that had been making up its mind. But the preparatory cold, the kind that gets into your fingers before you've been outside 5 minutes, and reminds you that Montana in winter is not a metaphor. It's a fact with edges. Mabel adjusted her fire management for the cold, which changed the ambient temperature inside the smokehouse in ways that affected the cure. She'd planned for this. She'd been planning for it since the first week, watching the temperature swings in the mornings and evenings, and doing the math in her head, adjusting her wood selection, choosing the denser pieces now that the outside air was pulling heat through the walls more aggressively. Cal noticed the wood selection change and asked about it. She explained it. He listened in the way she'd come to associate with him, not with enthusiasm exactly, but with the focused, slightly reluctant attention of someone who'd realized they were learning something useful and didn't want to admit how useful. "How do you know what kind of wood to use?" he said. "Feel of the heat," she said. "Dense wood burns slower and hotter. You want slow and even when it's cold outside because the walls are pulling heat. If you use light wood, your fire peaks and drops, and your smoke temperature yo-yos. Yo-yoing smoke temperature gives you uneven cure. Uneven cure gives you meat that's fine in the middle and too strong at the edges, and nobody notices until they're eating it and they can't tell you exactly why it's off, but it is." Cal looked at the wood pile. He looked at the smokehouse. He looked like someone filing information away for later. "Your dad teach you all this?" he said. "Most of it," she said. "Some of it I figured out by ruining things." He looked slightly startled, which she found faintly funny. People expected expertise to arrive without error. It never did. "What did you ruin?" "First time I managed the cure alone, I was 14. My father was sick for a week and I was running the smokehouse by myself. I let the fire run too hot for 2 days because I was afraid of it going out. And I oversmoked a whole batch of hams. We ate them all winter, but they were bitter, and my father knew why, and he didn't say a word about it, which was worse than if he'd said something." Cal was quiet. Then, "Did you ever tell him you knew he knew?" "No," she said, "but I never oversmoked a batch again." She went back to her work. Cal picked up a water barrel and carried it without being asked. It was not a friendship exactly. It was the early architecture of one, something that would need more time and more shared difficulty before it became the real thing. But it was more than what had been there 3 weeks ago, and Mabel noticed it in the careful, unsentimental way she noticed most things. On the 21st of November, Rowan asked her to eat dinner at the house. He said it stiffly, as if he'd rehearsed several versions and then gone with the bluntest one. "If you want, you don't have to." She had been eating at the bunkhouse table, which no one had told her to do, and no one had invited her to stop doing. The bunkhouse meals were adequate and functionally silent. She ate them quickly and went back to work. "All right," she said. The kitchen table had 4 chairs and he set 2 of them. Dex was apparently eating separately. She saw his plate on the counter, covered with a cloth. And Cal and the other men had the bunkhouse. She didn't know if Rowan ate alone usually, or if this was an adjustment of some kind. She didn't ask. He'd made beef stew, which he'd done himself, which surprised her. It was not a complicated beef stew. It was also not terrible. She ate without performing appreciation she didn't feel, and without withholding appreciation she did. She said it was good. He said he'd had to guess on the salt. She said it needed slightly less next time. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't immediately read, and then she realized it was amusement, just a thin line of it, across an otherwise serious face. "Most people just say it's fine," he said. "Most people are managing your feelings," she said. "The stew can take honest feedback." He laughed. It was brief, and it was the first time she'd heard it, and it changed his face substantially. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "Why did you come out here, to Harlow Creek? A woman with what you know about curing, you could have worked anywhere, a bigger ranch, a town with a proper operation." She turned that over for a moment. "I tried 2 other places before this," she said. "A ranch outside Bozeman and a provisioning company in Miles City." "What happened?" "The ranch in Bozeman had me doing the work while the foreman took credit for it. When I said something about it, they let me go." She paused. "The Miles City operation took one look at me and didn't let me through the door." Rowan didn't say anything. "The notice for your place was the 3rd one I found," she said, "and it said experience required, not young man required, not strong back required, just experience." She looked at him. That seemed like it might mean something. Rowan looked at his plate. He looked like a man doing a specific kind of accounting in his head, adding up things that had already happened and seeing their total for the first time. "I should have asked your name the day you came," he said. "Harlan should never have—" "You said that already," she said. Not harshly, just precisely. Saying it twice doesn't make it more true. He accepted that. She was starting to understand that he was a man who accepted correction without drama, which was rarer than people seemed to believe, and which she considered one of the more genuinely useful qualities in another human being. They finished dinner. She helped clear the plates, not because it was her job, but because it was reasonable. He made coffee. She drank it standing at the counter rather than sitting back down, because sitting back down would have felt like something neither of them had decided yet. "The cold front is coming," she said. "I'm calculating end of the month, maybe sooner. I need 2 more full rounds of cure before it hits, or we lose the timing window. What do you need from me?" "The men to be available for carrying and stacking over the next 5 days. And I need Harlan to stay out of the smokehouse." A pause. "He'll say I'm giving you authority over his people." "You are," she said, "for 5 days. You can give me authority for 5 days. The alternative is the cure window closes and we go into winter short." Rowan looked out the dark window over the sink. 5 days, he said. 5 days, she confirmed. She put down her coffee cup and walked back out to the smokehouse. The cold was significant now. She could feel the shift in it, the quality that said this is different from last week. The smoke rising from her chimney pipe caught the wind and tilted northward and thinned fast in the air, which told her the same thing. The real cold was gathering. She could feel it building from the north the way you feel a change in pressure before rain, not yet arrived, but close. She had 5 days, maybe less. She rebuilt the fire for the overnight and thought through the next rounds precisely. Every batch, every timing, every wood selection. She did this the way her father had taught her to do it, which was to think forward in time like reading a map. See where you're going before you start walking. Know the decision points before you reach them. When she finally lay down on the cot she'd moved into the smokehouse corner after the second week, the bunkhouse was too far away for overnight checks, and she didn't trust anyone else to hear the fire when it needed tending. She lay there in the smoke-warm air and thought about what Rowan had said. Why did you come out here? She hadn't told him all of it. She'd told him the factual part, the 2 jobs before, the notice, the word experience. She hadn't told him the rest of it, which was that after her father died in March, she'd spent approximately 6 weeks doing nothing useful at all. Just sitting in her father's empty smokehouse in Kentucky, not curing anything, not managing anything, just being in the only place that still felt like him. And that at the end of those 6 weeks she'd understood that she had to go somewhere new, or she was going to stay in that empty building for the rest of her life and let it be her whole world. And that would have been the saddest possible end to a life that hadn't started out sad. So she left. She took the bag and the knife and the knowledge, and she left. Harlow Creek was not where she'd expected to end up. Harlan Voss was not the welcome she'd hoped for. Rowan Mercer was not quite what she'd assumed a ranch owner would be. Neither as capable as she'd hoped, nor as hopeless as she'd feared, which made him complicated in a way she was still deciding what to do with. But the work was real. The fire was real. The smoke was real. And the cure. And the racks full of meat that would carry 37 people through a Montana winter. That was real. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind came down from the north and tested the walls, and the walls held, and the fire in the box breathed slow and steady, the way her father had taught her, the way she would teach no one and everyone over the course of a life she was still, at 26, only at the beginning of understanding. Tomorrow would be a hard day's work. The day after would be harder. The front was coming. She was ready for it. She was not perfectly ready, because perfect readiness was a thing that existed in the imagination and not in the world, and she had never confused the two. But she was ready enough. She had always been ready enough. That had to count for something. The 5 days she'd asked for turned into 4. Not because she finished early, because the weather didn't wait. She'd known the front was close. She'd felt it in the quality of the air, in the way the smoke from her chimney pipe tilted and then flattened, in the way the horses in the far pasture started moving differently, tighter together, heads lower. Animals knew before instruments did, and Mabel had spent enough of her life outdoors to read the same signals. But she'd estimated 2 more days of workable temperature, and she'd built her schedule around that estimate, and the weather had its own schedule and did not consult hers. She woke at 3 in the morning on the 26th of November to a sound she recognized before she was fully conscious, the specific sustained moan of wind that has committed. Not gusting, committed, the kind that settles in and means to stay. She was on her feet and at the firebox before her eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. The temperature inside the smokehouse had dropped 8 degrees since she'd gone to sleep. She could tell without a gauge. She could tell the way her father had taught her to tell, which was by the quality of the air in her lungs when she breathed in. Cold air in a smokehouse has a different texture than working temperature air. It's thinner somehow, drier, and it carries the smoke scent differently, sharper, and more astringent, like the smoke is working too hard. She loaded the firebox. She loaded it carefully, not too much at once, because packing a cold firebox too fast smothers instead of builds. And she watched the fire come back up with the focused attention of someone who understood that watching it come back up was not optional. Outside, the wind hit the walls in a sustained push that she felt in her feet through the floorboards. This was the front. This was what she'd been racing. She had 2 unfinished cure batches on the racks. 1 pork, 1 venison, both at the midpoint of their process, which was the worst possible place to be when conditions changed. A batch at the start could be modified. A batch at the end could be pushed through. A batch at the midpoint was committed to its current path, and that path required specific temperatures for specific durations, and the cold pressing through these walls was going to make that significantly harder to maintain. She did the math in her head, which she did quickly and without comfort. She needed to hold the smokehouse interior between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 14 hours. The wind outside was already dropping the ambient temperature, and it was going to keep dropping. She could hear it accelerating, that building pitch that told you the front was still arriving, still getting worse, that this wasn't the worst of it yet. To hold 55 degrees inside this building against what was coming outside, she was going to have to feed this fire every 45 minutes, maybe every 30, without interruption. For 14 hours. Possibly longer if the front was deeper than she'd judged. She could not leave. She could not sleep. She could not let the fire drop. She pulled her coat tighter and sat down on her cot and looked at the firebox and started thinking through what she had. Wood supply. Adequate if she was careful. She'd restacked it herself and she knew the quality of every section. Dense oak toward the back, which would be her main fuel through the cold hours. Lighter pine for quick catches if she needed to rebuild from a low point. A middle section of mixed hardwood she'd use as a bridge between the two. She'd done this planning automatically, without thinking of this specific night, just because it was the right way to manage a wood supply, and she was grateful now for the habit. Food. She had half a loaf of bread from yesterday and the remnant of a bean pot she'd set on the warming stone last evening. Not enough for 14 hours, but enough to keep her functional. She'd gone longer on less. Water. The barrel inside would freeze if the temperature in here dropped too far, which was information she filed and set aside. She'd deal with that if it happened. Light, 2 oil lamps and enough oil. The lamps also threw small heat, which was not nothing. She went to the door and looked out. The yard was already white. Not deeply. The snow was still coming in sideways and hadn't had time to accumulate much, but white enough to make the familiar shapes strange. The main house was dark. The bunkhouse had 1 window lit, which meant someone in there was awake, probably disturbed by the wind. The temperature hit her face like something physical, not just cold but pressured, the kind of cold that gets through your coat before you've been in it a minute. She went back inside and closed the door and latched it against the wind. She fed the fire. By 5 in the morning, the temperature outside had dropped to what she estimated was single digits. She was estimating by the behavior of everything around her. The way the door flexed in its frame, the ice forming at the corners of the small window, the smoke inside the building moving differently now, sluggish and low, because the temperature differential between inside and outside was significant enough to affect the draw. That was the thing about extreme cold that people who hadn't worked a smokehouse didn't understand. It didn't just make you uncomfortable, it changed the physics of everything you were trying to do. The fire you'd calibrated for 40-degree weather behaved differently at single digits. The smoke moved differently. The cure process slowed or accelerated in ways that weren't intuitive. You had to compensate constantly, and every compensation had a downstream effect on the next hour's conditions. She was compensating constantly. At 5:15, she added a section of dense oak and stood watching it catch, timing it in her head, and realized she'd been awake for approximately 26 hours. This was not a record. She'd done 32 once during a Kentucky summer when a heat spike had threatened a full batch and she'd stayed with it through 2 days and a night. But 32 had been summer, and summer tired was different from winter tired, which got into your bones in a specific way. She sat down. She ate bread. She stood back up and checked the racks. The pork was holding. She could tell by the color and by the smell. The cure was progressing, The smoke penetration was even. The surface had the right amount of firmness under her fingers when she pressed it. The venison was slightly more concerning. The lower end of the rack was running a degree or two cooler than she'd like, because that end was closer to the north wall, and the north wall was the one taking the worst of the wind. She repositioned 2 pieces from the lower rack to the middle rack, which was not ideal for the spacing but was better than uneven cure. At 6 in the morning, she heard someone at the door. She didn't move. She waited to see if the latch would hold. Sometimes people tried it once and moved on. The latch held, but the knocking started a second later, 3 solid raps. "Mabel." It was Cal's voice. "Mabel, you in there?" She crossed the space and unlatched the door and opened it 6 inches. Cal was standing in the snow with his hat pulled down and his coat collar up, and his expression doing several things at once. He looked at her face, at whatever her face was doing, which she couldn't assess from the inside. And then he looked past her at the fire, at the racks, at the state of the smokehouse interior. "I saw the chimney pipe working," he said. "Figured you were in here all night." "Yes," she said. "It's bad," he said. "Temperature's going to keep dropping. Dex says by afternoon it'll be—" "I know," she said. "I need the fire fed every 40 minutes. I can't leave to get more wood from the far stack. Can you—" "Yeah," he said before she finished. "Yeah, I'll bring it." She opened the door wider to let him in, and he came in and looked at the setup and didn't say anything stupid or unnecessary, which she'd come to appreciate about him. "How long do you need to hold it?" he said. "Till the batches finish. 8 hours at minimum. Could be 10. He nodded. He picked up the wood carrying yoke from the corner. She hadn't asked him to, he'd just seen it and picked it up. And he said he'd be back in 5 minutes with a load. He was back in 4. He didn't stay inside. He came and went every 40 minutes or so, carrying wood, stacking it where she pointed. Around 7 he brought coffee from the bunkhouse, which had been made too strong and too sweet, and she drank it anyway because her hands were cold, and the heat of the cup was worth the bad coffee. Rowan came at 7:30. He came in without knocking. The door was unlatched for the wood runs, and he stood inside the door and looked at the situation with the specific expression of a man who is calculating what he's looking at and doesn't entirely like the total. "You've been here all night," he said. "Yes." "You should have sent someone." "At 3 in the morning? Your men needed the sleep. I had it handled." He looked at her. He looked at the fire. He looked at the racks, which were full and holding. "What do you need?" he said. "Cal's been bringing wood. I need him to continue. I need the door checked every hour to make sure the latch is holding against the wind. It's been flexing, and if it blows open when the fire is in a sensitive stage, it'll spike the temperature in here in a way I can't recover from. And I need someone to check on the pigs. The smoke I've been running all night may have raised the barn temperature slightly if there's any chimney proximity, and in this cold that could condense on the— I'll check the barn," he said. "What else?" She stopped. She looked at him. I was standing there with his coat on and his hat in his hand, waiting, which was a different posture than she'd seen from him before. Not the exhausted waiting of a man tolerating a conversation, but the ready waiting of a man who intended to do whatever she said next. She felt something unexpected, which she chose not to examine closely. "That's everything for now," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on and went to check the barn. She turned back to the fire and felt that something in her chest settle into a different configuration than it had been in before. Something she didn't have a clean name for, but that had to do with not being alone in a situation that was hard. She'd been alone in hard situations for most of the past 8 months. She hadn't realized how much of her energy had gone into managing that aloneness until a portion of it was lifted. She fed the fire. She checked the racks. She calculated the next hour. The worst of the front came through between 9 and 11 in the morning. She knew it was the worst, not because it peaked dramatically. There was no dramatic peak, but because the wind hit a sustained level and stayed there, a constant pressure against the walls that made the smokehouse creak at intervals like a living thing registering pain. The temperature outside, which Dex had been monitoring at the main house with a thermometer mounted by the back door, dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Dex sent Cal with this information around 9:30, scrawled on a piece of paper in his large, careful handwriting. 4 degrees. Mabel folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and added a piece of oak to the fire. Inside the smokehouse, she was maintaining approximately 58 degrees, which she knew by feel and by the behavior of the smoke, and by the fact that her breath fogged when she exhaled, but only lightly. 58 was inside the window she needed. Barely. She was feeding the fire so often now that she barely had time to step back from the firebox before she needed to step forward again. Her legs ached. Her back ached worse. There was a specific spot between her shoulder blades that had been hurting since about 6 in the morning and had progressed from an ache to something with more personality to it. She shifted her weight. She did not sit down, because sitting down at this stage of the process meant the kind of drowsiness that could cost her 15 minutes of inattention, and 15 minutes of inattention at the wrong moment in the next few hours could mean the difference between batches that held and batches that didn't. Cal came at 10 with more wood and a plate covered with a cloth. "From Rowan," he said, holding it out. She took the cloth off. Eggs and salt pork, her own salt pork, from the first batch she'd cured, which she recognized by the color and the cut. She was more moved by that than she would have expected, and she was careful not to show it. "Tell him thank you," she said. Cal put the wood where she pointed. He hesitated at the door on his way out. "You're going to make it," he said. Not with certainty. That would have been hollow, and he was smart enough to know it. He said it the way you say something when you've watched someone work for 3 weeks and you've decided they're the kind of person who makes things work. A considered opinion rather than a comfort. She ate the eggs standing up, watching the fire, and didn't say anything. But she heard it. At noon, Harlan came. She hadn't expected that. She had in fact quietly assumed that the front was going to keep him at the bunkhouse or the barn, doing whatever Harlan did when circumstances moved beyond his management, which was usually something territorial and unhelpful. She'd factored his absence into her mental model of the day and had not left space for his presence. He opened the door without knocking, which was his standard approach, and he stood in the doorway. He didn't come in, just stood there. And he looked at the smokehouse interior with the expression of a man who is doing a private accounting and has not yet reached a total. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She'd learned that Harlan said more when she didn't fill the silence than when she did. He looked at the racks. He looked at the fire. He looked at her specifically, in a way that was different from his usual looking, which was dismissive. This looking had a different quality. She couldn't name it precisely. "How much longer?" he said. 4 hours? Maybe 5. He stood there another moment. Then he said, "I can split wood if you need more split." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has spent a long time committed to a position and is adjusting that position and does not find the adjustment comfortable but has decided to make it anyway. "The stuff by the east wall," she said after a moment. "The unsplit sections. I was going to need them split by this afternoon, and I didn't want to ask Cal again." He nodded. He pulled the door closed against the wind. She listened to the sound of the axe starting up outside, steady and even, and she turned back to the fire, and there was something in her throat that was not quite emotion but was adjacent to it, that she swallowed without allowing it to become anything more. Harlan Voss splitting wood for a woman he'd thrown a bag at 2 weeks ago. The world was strange and hard, and capable of adjustment she hadn't always believed it was capable of. She added a piece of oak to the fire. The batches finished at 3:17 in the afternoon by the small clock she kept on the shelf above the firebox. She knew they were done before she checked the clock. She knew it the way her father had taught her to know it, by smell and by feel, and by the specific way the smoke above the racks had thinned from active cure density to done cure density, a difference subtle enough that most people couldn't detect it, and certain enough that she'd have better life on it, which, in a practical sense, was exactly what she'd been doing for the past 12 hours. She pressed the surface of the pork and the venison piece by piece, working down the racks methodically. The firmness was right. The color was right. The surface texture was right. She leaned in close on the last venison piece and breathed in. The specific combination of smoke and salt and deep-cured protein that had been the smell of her entire childhood. And she was certain. She let the fire drop for the first time in 12 hours. She didn't kill it. You kept a low fire in a smokehouse through a freeze or you risked moisture. But she let it come down to maintenance level, and the physical act of not loading the firebox, of stepping back and simply watching rather than feeding, produced a feeling in her body that she'd been too busy to register until that moment. She was exhausted, comprehensively, thoroughly, in every component of herself. She sat down on her cot, and the sitting turned into lying, and the lying turned, within approximately 90 seconds, into sleep. She did not plan this. Her body simply made the decision without consulting her, and she didn't have enough left to argue with it. Ze became aware, at some point in that dark interval, of warmth across her shoulders that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. She surfaced partway from sleep, not fully, just enough to register, and understood that something had been placed over her. A coat. Heavy canvas, smelling of cold air and horses and wood smoke. She understood what it was and who had put it there. She did not open her eyes. She was not certain she could have opened her eyes if she'd tried. She went back down into sleep before the thought had fully finished forming. Later, she didn't know how much later, she heard voices in the yard. Not raised, not urgent. The particular murmur of men talking in low tones in the way they do when they don't want to disturb something. She opened her eyes. The smokehouse was dim. The fire was burning at maintenance level, which meant someone had managed it while she slept, because she'd set it at maintenance level, and maintenance level required tending, even if it required it less urgently. Someone had been in here while she slept and had watched the fire without waking her. The coat was still over her shoulders. She sat up slowly. The pain between her shoulder blades had become something more democratic. It was everywhere now, dispersed through her body like the cold had gotten into the joints and settled. She sat with it for a moment, taking inventory without complaint, which was how she'd been taught to assess pain. Not ignore it. Assess it. Know what's there so you can decide what you can ask of yourself next. She got up. The racks were full. Every piece of cured meat she'd been working toward for 3 weeks was there, finished and holding, row after row in the dim oil lamp light. The pork, the venison, the accumulated batches from the previous 2 weeks, properly stored below, sealed and logged. Every shelf had something on it. The smokehouse was as full as she had calculated it needed to be, plus the buffer she'd been working toward, plus what they'd just finished. She stood and looked at all of it for a moment. Outside the door, she heard a voice she recognized as Rowan's, and then Cal's, and then she opened the door and the cold hit her, and the yard was evening. Dark now. The snow accumulated over the day and still falling lightly, the wind dropped to something almost manageable. Rowan was standing about 10 feet from the door. He'd been walking toward it, she thought, or toward the smokehouse at least, and he stopped when she came out. He looked at her face probably, at the coat around her shoulders, which was his coat, and he looked at her the way he'd been learning to look at her, which was directly, without the overlay of assumption, just looking. Everything held, she said. He nodded. He looked past her at the smokehouse, at the smoke coming thin and steady from the iron pipe. I know, he said. Dex checked the racks an hour ago. He paused. He said, everything's there. Everything's there, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. The snow came down between them, slow and indifferent. You've been in there since 3 this morning, he said. Yes. You've been in there for 15 hours. She thought about pointing out that she was aware of how long she'd been in there. She decided not to. He wasn't reporting this to her as information. He was saying something else, something that didn't have a clean, direct form for him yet, and she could hear him working toward it. I wasn't going to lose the batches, she said, because that was the clean version of it, the true center of it. Not heroism, not performance, just the thing that had needed doing and couldn't be left undone. No, he said, I know that. He looked at her directly and said, I know you weren't. The weight in those words was not dramatic. It was simple, and it was real, and it was the first time she'd felt fully believed by another person in approximately 8 months, and she received it in her usual way, which was without visible reaction, while something inside her registered it completely. Cal came around the corner of the smokehouse with a stack of split wood, Harlan's work, from the afternoon, and saw them standing there and had the good sense to say nothing and keep walking to the wood stack. Mabel reached up and took Rowan's coat from her shoulders and held it out to him. He took it. Their hands were close for a moment in the exchange, not quite touching. The cold air moved between them. The buffer batch needs 3 more days of low cure, she said. I'll need to tend the overnight fire still, but it doesn't need the intensity of today. All right, he said. And I'd like to sleep inside tonight, in the bunkhouse. I can check the fire at midnight and at 4. I'll take the midnight check, he said. She looked at him. "I can manage a maintenance fire for one check," he said, and there was something almost defensive in it, which she found unexpectedly human. "I'll show you the level before I go in," she said. She showed him. He paid attention in the careful, slightly self-conscious way of a person learning something in front of someone they respect. He asked 2 questions, both of which were good questions. She answered them. When she finally walked across the snow-covered yard toward the bunkhouse, Dex was sitting on the step with a cup of coffee. He looked at her as she came up, and he moved over on the step to make room, which was as overt a welcome as she'd seen from him, and she sat down next to him and let the cold and the exhaustion and the day rest on her for a moment without trying to manage any of it. He poured a second cup from the pot he'd had between his feet, keeping it warm, and handed it to her. She drank it. It was terrible coffee, same as always. "Good work today," Dex said. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out at the snow-covered yard and the main house and the smokehouse with its thin thread of smoke against the darkening sky. "Yeah," she said. That was all either of them said. But Dex sat there with her until the cup was empty, and the cold got serious enough that going inside made sense, and that wordless company in the dark, after a day like this day, was more than she'd expected from anyone on this ranch when she'd come through that gate with mud on her bag and a key nobody had wanted to give her. She went inside. She lay down on the bunk and pulled the blanket up and was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd been trying to hold. The fire in the smokehouse held steady through the night, tended at midnight by a rancher who'd finally started paying attention to what was right in front of him. And by 4 in the morning, Mabel was back at the firebox herself, checking the level, making her notes in the small ledger, doing what she'd come here to do. The front had passed. The racks were full. The ranch was going to make it through winter. The 3 days after the front passed had a different quality than anything that had come before them. Not easier, exactly. The cold had settled in permanently now, the kind that stops being an event and becomes a condition, something you stop remarking on because remarking on it doesn't change it. The temperature didn't climb back above 15 degrees for the rest of that week. The snow stayed where it had fallen, compacted and hard-crusted, and the yard made a sound like breaking crockery when you walked across it in the early morning. But something in the ranch itself had shifted. Mabel felt it without being able to point at any single thing that explained it. The men moved differently, not more cheerfully, not with any obvious change in expression or speech, but with a different quality of purpose. Cal stopped doing the half-step, the deliberate slowness she'd cataloged in those first weeks. Dex, who had always been steady, became something more than steady, attentive in the way of a man who has decided something matters and is acting accordingly. Even the older hand, Pete, who had said almost nothing to her in 6 weeks, started leaving the water barrel at the smokehouse door without being asked, the same way Dex had started doing in the first week, which told her they'd talked about it. She didn't remark on any of this. She received it the way she received most things, noted it, filed it, kept moving. The buffer batch finished on the 29th. She logged the final entries in her ledger, tallied the complete inventory, and stood in the smokehouse doing arithmetic in her head for the 3rd time because the numbers were large enough that she wanted to be certain before she reported them to Rowan. When she was certain, she went to the main house and knocked. He was at the kitchen table with his papers again. He always seemed to be at the kitchen table with his papers. She had formed the impression, over 6 weeks, that the papers were in some permanent state of crisis that he managed rather than resolved, and that this was so normal to him that he no longer registered it as crisis. She read him the numbers. He put down his pen. She read them again because he hadn't said anything. "That's," he started and stopped and looked out the window, and she recognized that particular pause, the one she'd first seen the morning she'd read him the mid-month inventory, the one that meant he was calculating something that had personal meaning to him beyond the arithmetic. "That's 2 weeks past what I was hoping for," he said. 2.5, she said. "If you're careful with portioning through January, potentially 3. I've written out the recommended distribution schedule." She set the ledger open on the table, the last 2 pages filled with her compressed handwriting. "This keeps the heaviest protein portions in the deep cold months and scales back to the lighter cuts as you move toward March, when hunting picks up again." He looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, reading it, and she stood there and waited because she'd learned that he needed time to process written information, not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. And thorough was a quality she respected enough to accommodate. "Mabel," he said. "Yes." The agreement was 6 weeks. She knew. She had known for the past 10 days, had been tracking it the way she tracked everything, precisely, without drama, storing the information for when it became relevant. The 6 weeks ended on December 2nd, 3 days from now. She said, "You're planning to leave." It wasn't exactly a question. She thought about how to answer it accurately. "I've been planning to leave since I arrived," she said. That was the agreement. He looked at her. He had a particular way when something mattered to him, of going very still. Not the stillness of a man with nothing to say, but the stillness of a man with more to say than he currently knows how to organize. "I'd like you to stay," he said. She had expected something like this. She had not expected it to land the way it landed, which was with more weight than she'd assigned to the possibility in her planning. "As what?" she said, carefully. Not unkindly, but carefully. "As—" He stopped. He picked up the pen and set it down. "The same job if you want it. Extended through spring. Better pay. I should have offered more from the start, and I knew it at the time, and I told myself the ranch couldn't afford it, and that was half true and half me not thinking straight." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has prepared a version of this conversation and is already aware that the version he prepared is not quite adequate to what the moment actually requires. "I've had extended offers before," she said. "At the Bozeman Ranch. They extended me twice." "And?" "And nothing changed except that I stayed longer before it fell apart." She wasn't saying this to punish him. She was saying it because it was true, and because she'd decided, sometime in the past 3 weeks, that she wasn't going to manage Rowan Mercer's feelings at the expense of her own clear thinking. A longer version of the same arrangement isn't different from the original arrangement. Same authority, same limitations, same position. He was quiet. "What would be different?" she said. Not a challenge. An actual question asked with actual curiosity about whether he had an answer. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly, which she'd noticed he did when he was thinking about something he hadn't finished thinking about yet. "I don't know yet," he said. "I know I don't want to lose what you've built here. I know the smokehouse runs differently under you than it's run in the 4 years I've owned this place. I know that what you did during the front—" He stopped again. He said with some effort, "I know I wouldn't have gotten through this winter without you. That's not a figure of speech. I'm telling you that accurately." She absorbed this. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. Which was true. She did appreciate it. She simply wasn't sure what to do with it yet. "Think about it," he said. "You've got 3 days." She picked up the ledger from the table. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it while she tended the maintenance fire. She thought about it while she walked the inventory shelves, checking the curing on the stored batches, doing the visual assessment she did every day out of habit. She thought about it in the bunkhouse that night, lying on her back in the dark, listening to the wind outside and Dex's steady breathing from across the room. She thought about what Bozeman had felt like. She thought about Miles City. She thought about the 12 months between her father's death and Harlow Creek, which had been the loneliest 12 months of her life, even though she'd been surrounded by people for most of them, and which had produced in her a specific kind of armor she was only now beginning to notice the weight of. She thought about Cal asking her how she learned what she knew, and actually listening to the answer. She thought about Dex on the step with the terrible coffee. She thought about Rowan standing in the smokehouse doorway at 3 in the morning saying you need anything, and the particular surprise of it, and how she hadn't forgotten it. She thought about her father's smokehouse in Kentucky, empty and cold. She thought about the fact that she'd given up the lease on it when she left, because she couldn't afford to keep it and go, and because she'd needed to go, and because she had understood that keeping it would have meant keeping one foot in a life that was over. She thought about the word home, which she turned over in her mind like a stone you find in a creek, examining it from different angles without being entirely sure what you're looking for. She didn't reach a conclusion that night. She reached the beginning of one, which she recognized by the feeling of it, a loosening in the chest, a slowing of the specific mental churn she'd been running since she arrived. Not certainty. The early approach of something that might become certainty if she gave it enough time. She gave it until the 1st of December. Harlan found her first. She was splitting some of the unsplit sections from the east wall, not because she needed to, but because physical work was how she processed things, and she'd learned to give it what it needed. And he came around the corner of the smokehouse and stopped when he saw her. She kept splitting. She didn't stop or look up. She'd learned that people said more honest things when you weren't looking directly at them. He stood there for a moment. Then he sat down on the stump she'd been using as a splitting block before she'd moved to the ground, which told her he was planning to stay for a while. "Rowan tell you he wants you to stay," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "You deciding?" "Yes." He was quiet. She split a section, stacked it, positioned the next one. "I owe you an apology," he said. She stopped. She straightened up and looked at him. He was looking at the ground between his boots, which was its own kind of honesty. "The bag," he said. "First day. That was—" He stopped. He started again. There wasn't any call for it. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who had built a significant portion of his self-image on a certainty she'd made untenable. And he was sitting on a stump in the snow acknowledging it, and she could see what it was costing him, and she wasn't going to minimize that cost or inflate it. "No," she said, "there wasn't." He nodded. He looked like he'd expected something harder, and was recalibrating. "I heard about Bozeman," he said. "Cal told me what you said." She wondered exactly what Cal had told him, and decided it didn't matter. "People treat you a certain way long enough," he said slowly. "You start to think that's just how things are. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that's how it gets in you without you deciding to let it in." She thought about this. She thought about the 12 months after her father died, and the armor she'd accumulated, and how she hadn't decided to build it. It had just assembled itself one piece at a time, the same way most things that aren't good for you do. "I know," she said. He looked up. "Doesn't mean it wasn't your choice," she said, "but I know how it gets in." He was quiet for another moment. Then he got up off the stump, and he picked up one of the unsplit sections from the pile, and he positioned it on the block, and without asking, he started splitting alongside her. They worked in silence for about 20 minutes. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was a productive one, and it was progress. And she understood that progress was usually what the world offered instead of resolution, and that taking it was wiser than holding out for the thing it wasn't. On the 1st of December, she went to find Rowan. He was in the barn, which she hadn't expected, working on a harness that had broken somewhere in the chaos of the front and hadn't been repaired yet. He was not naturally gifted at harness repair. She could tell by the way he was doing it, too careful, checking each step twice. The particular focus of a man doing something he didn't fully trust himself to do correctly. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment and watched him work. And she thought, this is what he actually is. Not the tired man at the kitchen table with the papers. Not the man who let Harlan throw a bag into the mud and didn't come out. This, the man in the barn in the cold, doing the hard, unglamorous maintenance that kept things functioning, doing it imperfectly and carefully and without anyone watching. She had made decisions about people on less. "Rowan," she said. He looked up. He saw her expression, whatever her expression was doing, and he set the harness down and gave her his full attention. "I have a counter," she said. He waited. "Not extended employment," she said. "I'm not doing another Bozeman. Another place where I do the work and hold a title that means what the person with the real authority decides it means on any given day." He was very still. "What do you want?" he said. "Partnership," she said. "Not symbolic, actual, equal say in decisions that affect the smokehouse operation, the provisioning strategy, and any expansion we pursue in the spring. My name on the arrangement in writing, which I know is irregular, and I don't particularly care that it's irregular." He looked at her. "And you stay on as owner and primary operator of the ranch's everything else," she continued. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to have something that's actually mine. There's a difference." The barn was quiet except for one of the horses shifting in its stall. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. 3 days, she said. "Which is what you gave me." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, more like a smile's first cousin. "You could have asked for more time." "I didn't need more. I needed 3 days." He looked down at the harness. He looked at her. He looked like a man who had been running a ranch alone for 4 years and had arrived, through a specific series of events he hadn't predicted, at a moment where alone was no longer either necessary or wise, and who was deciding whether the adjustment frightened him more than the alternative. "It's irregular," he said. I know. People in town will talk. People in town already talk, she said. Gerald Pratt made a joke about me in your yard. The town watched. You said what you said. They talked about that too. He was quiet. I'm not making this decision based on what people in Harlow Creek are going to say about it, he said. I'm making it based on whether it's the right thing for this ranch. Is it? She said. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the harness and set it on the rack and turned back to her. You know what the ranch looked like before you got here, he said. You saw the smokehouse. You saw the inventory sheets. Or you saw what was supposed to be inventory sheets, which was mostly guesswork and optimism. He said it without self-pity, which she appreciated. Just the facts, assessed plainly. I've been running this place on insufficient information and too much pride for about 2 years, telling myself it would come together. He paused. You came in here for 6 weeks and changed the margin between this ranch surviving the winter and not surviving it. That's not a figure of speech either. The numbers you put in that ledger. I know what they mean. Yes, she said. So when you ask me if a partnership is right for this ranch, he said, the answer is yes. Obviously yes. The question I'm actually sitting with is whether I've earned the right to ask for it. She looked at him. The barn was cold and it smelled of hay and horse and harness leather. And it was not a setting that invited sentimentality, which suited her. You haven't, she said. Not fully. He absorbed that without flinching. But you're running a ranch that would have gone under in January, she said. And you know it, and you're not lying to yourself about it, and you asked me to stay without dressing it up as something other than what it is. That's... She stopped. She chose her words the way she chose her wood, for what they'd actually do rather than how they'd look. That's more than I've gotten from most people. He looked at her steadily. Is it enough? It's enough to start, she said. He held out his hand. Not a grand gesture, just a hand extended across the cold barn air. She took it. They shook once, which was businesslike, and then he didn't immediately let go, which was something else. I'll have something written up, he said. Dex can witness it. Good, she said. She went back to the smokehouse. She stood inside in the familiar smoke-warm air and looked at the full racks and the organized shelves and the fire burning at exactly the level she'd set it, and she felt the thing she'd been feeling at the edges for 3 days settle into the center of her. She was not going to leave. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because she had decided to stay, which was completely different, and which she had not been able to say about any place for 8 months. The written arrangement took Rowan 2 days to draft, which she found out later was because he wrote 4 versions and threw 3 of them away, a fact she learned from Cal, who had excellent hearing and poor judgment about when to share what he'd heard. She received this information without comment and filed it under things that are endearing and inconvenient simultaneously. When Rowan brought her the 4th version, she read it at the kitchen table while he stood near the window doing a credible impression of a man who was not watching her read it. It was 3 pages, handwritten, specific in a way that told her he'd thought carefully about what she'd said and had tried to address it directly rather than drafting something that sounded good without meaning much. She had 3 comments. He incorporated all 3 without argument. Dex witnessed it with his large, careful signature and the expression of a man who had been waiting for something like this to happen and was quietly satisfied that it had. She kept her copy in the ledger. It was the first thing she'd owned in Harlow Creek that wasn't the clothes on her back and the knife in her coat pocket, and she was more aware of that fact than she let anyone see. December moved in the way. December moves in Montana, relentlessly, with the commitment of something that has a job to do and intends to do it, regardless of how anyone feels about it. The temperature stayed below 20 for 3 weeks straight. The snow deepened. The road to Harlow Creek became what Dex called advisory only, which meant you could probably make it, but you might not, and you were on your own either way. The ranch turned inward, which was what ranches did in winter. Work contracted to its essential components: animal care, fire management, equipment maintenance, food preparation from the stores Mabel had built. The days were short, and the evenings were long, and people spent more time in each other's company than they might have chosen in better weather. This produced changes in the human architecture of the place. Not dramatic changes, the daily life kind, which were slower and in some ways more significant. Cal started asking Mabel questions in the evenings, not about smokehouse work specifically, but about curing techniques in general, about her father's methods, about variations she'd seen or read about. He had, she realized, a practical and genuine interest in preservation work, in the whole problem of keeping food through seasons, which was an old and serious problem that most people didn't engage with until it was urgent. She answered his questions with the same directness she brought to everything. He started keeping notes, which she did not comment on, but noticed. Dex, who had always been the ranch's quiet axis, became something like a friend. Not the announced kind. Nothing was announced, but the kind that accumulates through shared mornings and honest conversation and the specific closeness of people who have been cold and tired together. I was 61, she learned, and had been on ranches in Montana for 35 years and had strong opinions about nearly everything that he expressed in the fewest possible words, which was a communication style she found deeply compatible with her own. Harlan remained complicated. He was not, after his apology and the wood-splitting afternoon, suddenly easy. He was still territorial and still prone to a specific kind of commentary that got under her skin in ways she preferred not to examine. But he was different in a way that was real, not performed. He managed it. She managed it. They worked around each other without collision, and after 20 years of working on other people's ranches, she understood that this was usually the actual outcome of conflict, not resolution, but navigation. And navigation was something she could do. Rowan was the most changed, or perhaps she simply knew him better now and was seeing what had always been there. He came to the smokehouse in the evenings with less pretext than before, less of the just checking on inventory that had been his early cover for coming by, and more of the honest version, which was that the smokehouse in December was the warmest outbuilding on the ranch, and he liked the company. They talked. Actually talked. Not the transaction of information she'd learned to call conversation in places where real conversation wasn't offered, but the kind that went in directions neither of them had planned. He told her about the 4 years he'd been running the Mercer Ranch, which had belonged to his uncle before him and had not been in good condition when he inherited it. He told her about the 2 years before that, when he'd been somewhere else entirely, doing work that had nothing to do with ranching and which he didn't describe in detail. She didn't push for the detail. People told you what they were ready to tell you. She told him about her father, not the sentimentalized version she'd edited down to something manageable, the actual version, which was complicated. A man of significant skill and significant stubbornness, who had loved her and taught her everything useful she knew, and who had also never, not once in her 26 years, said directly that he was proud of her, though she had spent most of her life managing the hope that he was. He'd been sick for 3 months before he died, and she'd run the smokehouse alone, and he'd watched her do it from the window of his room above, and he had still not said the word. She told Rowan this one evening in December without having planned to tell anyone, and she heard herself saying it and registered a faint surprise, the way you're surprised when something that's been in a closed drawer for a long time is simply open. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think he knew?" "Knew what?" "That you didn't need him to say it, that you already knew." She thought about this for longer than she usually let herself think about things regarding her father. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe he just couldn't figure out how." "People are bad at the things that matter most," he said. Not as wisdom, as personal fact. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire with the expression of a man speaking from specific experience. "Yes," she said. They sat with that for a while. The fire held steady. Outside, the snow came down in the dark, and the ranch buildings held their warmth against it, and the shelves in the smokehouse stood full from floor to rafter with the work of 6 weeks and 1 long night. She did not feel happy in any clean, simple way. She felt something more honest than that. The particular satisfaction of a person who has done hard things and made clear decisions and arrived somewhere that is hers, fully and specifically hers, in a way that no one can retroactively remove. She was aware, sitting there, that she was building something. Not just the partnership, not just the smokehouse, but the slower and more uncertain thing that doesn't have a business name. The accumulation of days that gradually becomes a life rather than an interlude. She had been living in interludes for 8 months. She understood now what that had felt like, because she could feel the difference. She added a piece of oak to the fire and listened to it catch, and outside the snow kept coming down on Harlow Creek, and on the mountains to the north, and on the road that was advisory only, covering everything equally, the way it always did. January came in hard and stayed hard. The kind of cold that stops being a weather condition and becomes a philosophical position. The world asserting that it does not particularly care about your plans or your comfort or your sense of how things ought to go. The Mercer Ranch operated at its winter minimum. Essential work, essential movement, everything stripped back to what mattered and nothing else. Mabel had expected this to feel like confinement. It didn't. She'd spent enough of her life in motion, city to city, job to job, always the new person in the room who hadn't yet proved herself. That the enforced stillness of a Montana January felt less like a trap and more like permission. Permission to stay in one place long enough to know what it felt like. Permission to stop calculating the exit before she'd fully arrived. She used January to plan. The smokehouse was full, inventory managed, maintenance fires running on a schedule. Cal had mostly taken over with a competence that had stopped surprising her around week 3. She had time, for the first time in months, to think beyond the immediate problem toward the larger one, which was that the Mercer Ranch was surviving winter but only just, and surviving winter was not the same as being viable in any sustainable sense. She started keeping a second ledger, not inventory, projections. What the smokehouse could produce in a full operating year if it wasn't starting from a broken down, cold since August condition in October. What a summer curing season looked like with proper preparation, what they could sell, and to whom, and at what margin, if the operation ran the way she knew it could run. She showed Rowan the second ledger on a Thursday evening in mid-January. He read it the way he read everything she gave him, slowly, thoroughly, with the occasional small movement of his lips that meant he was doing arithmetic. He set it down on the kitchen table. "This is ambitious," he said. "This is accurate," she said. "Ambitious would be the page after that." He looked at her. "There's a page after that?" "In my head. I didn't write it yet because I wanted to see how you handled the first one." Something crossed his face. That expression she'd cataloged over the past 2 months. The one that was amusement trying to stay professional. "And?" "You didn't immediately tell me it was impossible," she said. "That's the threshold." He looked back at the ledger. He turned to the margin notes she'd made, which were detailed. Suppliers, timing, the specific argument for why the Valley's other ranches would buy preserved meat from a well-run operation rather than managing their own curing, which most of them did badly, because most people did it badly, unless they'd grown up doing it right. "Gerald Pratt isn't going to like this," he said. "Gerald Pratt sells salt and takes a margin on everything that moves through Harlow Creek," she said. "If we're sourcing directly and selling directly, yes. He's going to like it less than he likes me currently, which is already not much. He's got relationships in town. We've got the best smokehouse product in 100 miles. People buy what's good when they can, and when they can't tell the difference, they buy from who they trust, and trust is built over time." She paused. "We have time." Rowan was quiet for a moment. I was looking at the ledger, but she could tell he wasn't reading it anymore. He was somewhere else, doing the private accounting he did when something was shifting in his thinking. "When I took this ranch over," he said slowly, "my uncle left me with a list, things the ranch needed to do to stay viable. I've been working that list for 4 years, and I've gotten through about half of it, and the other half keeps moving." He stopped. He touched the ledger without picking it up. "This isn't on the list." "No," she said. "This is a different list." "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her directly. "I think I've been so focused on surviving the list I inherited that I stopped asking what the ranch could actually become." She didn't say anything, because he was working through something, and she'd learned the difference between the silence that needed filling and the silence that needed to be left alone. "Yeah," he said finally, "show me the page that's still in your head." She pulled the second ledger toward her and turned to the blank page at the back and started talking. February was when Harlow Creek found out. Not all at once. The way news moved in small towns was gradual and then sudden, a slow accumulation of partial information and inference, followed by the moment when enough pieces were in enough hands that the picture resolved itself whether anyone intended it to or not. What got out first was the inventory numbers, which Rowan had mentioned to 2 men at the supply run in late January. Not bragging, just answering a direct question about how the ranch had fared through the front, and which those 2 men had repeated with embellishment to others, and so on. By the time the story reached the far end of Harlow Creek, it had acquired some details she doubted were accurate, but the core of it was true enough. The Mercer Ranch had come through the worst November cold front in 6 years, with full winter stores and a buffer,
which no ranch in the valley had managed, and the woman Rowan had hired to run the smokehouse was the reason. Gerald Pratt heard this version sometime in the first week of February. She knew he'd heard it because he came to the ranch. She saw his wagon coming up the road from the main house window, where she'd been going over the spring supply list with Rowan. She recognized the wagon, and she recognized the particular quality of his arrival. Too fast for a casual visit, the horse pushed a little harder than necessary. "Pratt," she said. Rowan looked up. He looked out the window. He set his pen down. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'd rather be there," she said. He considered this. "All right." They met Pratt in the yard. He came down from the wagon with the expression of a man who had prepared what he wanted to say and intended to say it regardless of how the landing went. "Rowan," he said.
He looked at Mabel with the particular non-acknowledgement of a man who has decided that not looking at someone directly is its own statement. "I've been hearing things." "Probably accurate," Rowan said. "You're planning to sell direct. Cut out the provisioning channel." "We're planning to expand the smokehouse operation in spring and offer product directly to ranches and households in the valley," Rowan said. "Not aggressive, just clear." "Yes." Pratt's jaw did something. "I've been the provisioning connection for this valley for 11 years. "I know that." "You undercut that. You're not just affecting my business. You're affecting how this whole community functions." Mabel thought about letting Rowan carry this, which he was doing fine. She thought about stepping back and being the quiet partner in this moment. Then she thought about the first day, and the bag in the mud, and Gerald Pratt's voice in the yard saying "fat woman running a smokehouse." And she decided she'd been quiet in enough rooms for enough reasons, and this wasn't a room that required it. "Mr. Pratt," she said. He looked at her. He didn't want to, but he did. "Your provisioning channel exists because nobody in this valley had a better option," she said. "That's not community infrastructure. That's a gap you filled, and you've done well filling it, and you'll continue to do well because most of what you carry, we don't touch." She kept her voice even. Even was more effective than heated, and she'd had a lot of practice with even. "But if you're going to stand in this yard and tell me that the Mercer Ranch doesn't have the right to sell the product of its own smokehouse directly, I'd like to hear the argument, because I don't think you have one." Pratt stared at her. "My name is Mabel Ashcroft," she said. "I'm a partner in this operation, and I'd appreciate it if you'd look at me when we're talking." Something shifted in Pratt's face. It wasn't a comfortable shift. It was the shift of a man encountering something that doesn't fit the category he'd assigned it to, and having to either revise the category or ignore the evidence, and finding, to his probable irritation, that ignoring the evidence was harder than he'd expected. He looked at Rowan. "Partner," he said flatly. "Since December," Rowan said. Pratt was quiet for a long moment. Then he got back in his wagon without another word, which was a retreat dressed up as a decision, and she let him have that because the outcome was what mattered, not the performance. The wagon moved down the road. Rowan watched it go. "He'll make things difficult," he said. "For a while," she said. "Then our product will sell and people will buy it, and he'll adjust because men like Pratt are pragmatic when the alternative is pointless." She turned back toward the house. "He's not the first man who's tried to make things difficult. He won't be the last." Rowan followed her inside. He picked up his pen. She picked up her list. They went back to work. Spring came to Harlow Creek, the way spring always comes to high Montana. Not gradually, not gracefully, but in a series of contested days where winter refused to concede without argument, temperatures swinging 20 degrees between morning and afternoon, mud appearing and freezing and appearing again, the ground unable to decide what season it was committed to. Mabel didn't mind the indecision. She was busy. The spring preparation she'd planned through January and February came into operation in March, and the reality of executing a plan was always different from the plan itself. Not better or worse, but different, requiring constant adjustment of the kind that exhausted people who needed certainty and energized people who were comfortable with problems. She was comfortable with problems. The smokehouse expansion, a second, larger fire chamber she and Rowan had designed over the winter, which Dex and Cal built in March under her direction, doubled the production capacity. The new chamber ran a different smoke profile than the original, which she'd planned for, but the interaction between the two chambers when both were running created a draft pattern she hadn't fully anticipated, which took her 4 days to diagnose and correct. When she corrected it, The result was actually better than what she'd modeled. The draft created a natural rotation of smoke through both chambers that produced more even cure distribution than either chamber alone would have managed. She made a note of this in the ledger. Not triumphant, just precise. Cal had become, by this point, something she would have called an apprentice if either of them had used that word, which they didn't. He ran the original chamber's daily operations under her oversight and had stopped needing the oversight for most of it. He made decisions now, small ones, the kind that accumulated, and he made them correctly about 80% of the time, which was better than her own rate had been at 20, and she told him so. He looked surprised. "You made mistakes?" "Constantly," she said. "I still make mistakes. The difference is I know what to do when I realize it." He thought about this. "How do you know when you've realized it?" "The meat tells you," she said. "The smoke tells you. Everything in a smokehouse tells you when something's wrong if you're paying enough attention to hear it. Most people aren't paying enough attention." "How do you learn to pay that much attention?" "You care about the outcome," she said simply. "Not about looking like you know what you're doing, about the actual outcome. Those are different things, and they produce different kinds of attention." He thought about this for longer than most of her answers made him think. Then he went back to the fire. She watched him go and thought about her father again, about standing in the Kentucky smokehouse at 14 and making the mistakes that were hers to make, and her father watching from the window and saying nothing. She'd resented the silence then. She understood it better now, not completely, but better. Some things couldn't be taught through instruction. They had to be arrived at through the specific experience of being responsible for something that could fail. She hoped Cal would fail at something manageable before he failed at something that mattered. That was the best she could do for him. Set up the conditions where the small failures happened in time to teach before the large ones became possible. Well, the first outside sale happened in April. A rancher named Briggs, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles north of Harlow Creek, had heard about the Mercer smokehouse through Dex, who had known Briggs for 15 years and mentioned in passing that the operation was producing in spring now, which Dex knew would get back to her because Dex understood how information moved better than anyone on the ranch. Briggs came on a Wednesday with a practical problem. His own curing operation had failed to produce adequately through the winter. His smokehouse hand had been sick through the critical November period, and nothing had been properly managed. And he was looking at a spring shortfall that meant buying provision at considerable expense. Mabel met with him at the smokehouse. Rowan was there, but he let her lead it, which had become their natural operating mode without either of them announcing it. She handled what pertained to the smokehouse and production. He handled what pertained to the ranch's broader operations, and where they overlapped, they talked it through. Briggs was a direct man, which she appreciated. He looked at her inventory, asked specific questions about cure methods and quantities, and did not make any remarks about her appearance or her qualifications, which by April she had stopped expecting as a given and had started noticing as a quality worth cataloging. They agreed on terms. Not complex terms. A straight exchange of cured product for a quantity of salt and hardwood she needed for the spring runs, plus a cash arrangement for the surplus. Briggs shook her hand and Rowan's hand and went home. When his wagon had cleared the gate, Rowan looked at her. "That's the first one," he said. "Yes," she said. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about this honestly, rather than reaching for the easy answer. "Like I want to not ruin the next batch," she said. "Now that someone outside the ranch is depending on it." He laughed. The real laugh. The one that changed his face, that she'd been hearing more often since December. "That's the most honest answer to that question I've ever heard." "I don't have the other kind," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the look she'd been seeing from him more frequently lately. Not the appraising look of those early weeks, not the guilty look of a man recalculating what he'd assumed, but something else. Something that had been building slowly through January and February and March, and that she was aware of without yet having decided what to do about it. She went back inside and started the afternoon fire. Briggs told 2 people, those 2 people told others. By May, 3 more ranches had come to her. Not all of them were straightforward. One rancher, a man named Hollister who ran sheep on the eastern side of the valley, arrived with the specific manner of a man who has been told something is good but intends to verify it himself before admitting it, which meant he questioned everything she said about the curing process with a skepticism that was not quite rudeness but was adjacent to it. She answered every question. She didn't perform patience, She actually had patience, because people who asked a lot of questions were people who were genuinely trying to understand, and people who were trying to understand were people you could do business with. The ones who didn't ask questions and assumed they already knew were the ones who caused problems later. Hollister left with a trial order, and the expression of a man who had not found what he'd come looking for, which was a reason to say no. He came back in June with a larger order and a neighbor he'd brought along without calling ahead, which was the ranching equivalent of a strong recommendation. By June, the Mercer Smokehouse had 6 regular customers in the valley. Gerald Pratt had said nothing more to them directly since February. But she heard, through the particular information network that operated in small communities through the medium of whoever ran the post and the dry goods, that he'd been describing the Mercer operation in unflattering terms to anyone who'd listen. She heard specifically that he'd told at least 2 people that the product quality wouldn't hold, that it was a seasonal fluke, that you couldn't trust a smokehouse run by. And here the accounts varied, because Pratt was apparently smart enough to shift his language depending on his audience. But the meaning was consistent. She didn't respond to any of it publicly. She didn't send word through the same network. She just kept producing good product and letting people draw their own conclusions from what was in front of them, which was the only argument that had ever worked for her. It continued to work. The moment that mattered most, the one she would carry longest, happened in July and had nothing to do with business. She was in the smokehouse in the late afternoon, the new chamber running its second full summer batch, when Cal came to the door with an expression that told her something had happened that he wasn't sure how to approach her about. "What?" she said. "There's a woman from town," he said, "asking for you specifically. I put her on the porch." Mabel came out. The woman on the porch was perhaps 30, with a practical coat and the particular look of someone who has made a decision and is committing to it before she loses her nerve. She was not anyone Mabel recognized from her months in and out of Harlow Creek. "Miss Ashcroft?" the woman said. "Yes." "My name is Ruth Carey. She stopped. She looked at her hands briefly and then back up. "I heard about you. About what you did here. I've been working at the Pratt store for 3 years and She stopped again. "I've been looking for a way out of it. I heard you're expanding in spring, and I wondered if there was any kind of work here. Any kind at all." Mabel looked at her. She looked at the specific quality of this woman's composure, which was the composure of someone holding themselves together by deciding not to let go, which she recognized intimately from the inside. "What kind of work do you do?" she said. "Inventory, accounting, mostly. I keep the store's books. I'm good with numbers." Ruth Carey said this last part with a slight lift of the chin that was half confidence and half apology for having confidence, which Mabel also recognized. "Come inside," she said. They sat at the kitchen table. She'd started thinking of it as the kitchen table rather than Rowan's kitchen table somewhere in February, a shift she'd noted and then moved past. And she asked Ruth Carey specific questions about what she knew and what she'd done and what she understood about how a growing operation managed its accounts. Ruth answered specifically and without embellishment, which was a good sign. People who embellished in interviews were people who managed your expectations at the expense of accuracy, and accuracy was the only thing she'd ever valued. Rowan came in halfway through and sat down at the far end of the table and listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she'd heard enough, she said, "I'd want to see your work before anything's decided. Bring me a sample of what you do. Accounts, an inventory summary, whatever you have that shows how you think. Come back on Monday." Ruth Carey came back on Monday with 3 weeks of the Pratt store's accounts reconstructed from memory, because she hadn't felt right taking the actual records, which told Mabel something about her character that was more useful than any reference could have been. She was hired by the end of that Monday. When Ruth had gone, Rowan came to find Mabel in the smokehouse. "She worked for Pratt," he said. "Yes." "He's going to be... I know," she said. "He'll be angry, and he'll say things, and then he'll move on because he doesn't have another option." She looked up from the rack she was checking. "She's good, Rowan. The way she presented those accounts. She thinks clearly, and she works carefully, and she's been underused for 3 years. That's the kind of person you hire when you find her." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like you know the feeling." "I do," she said. "I know it very well." He held her gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than the conversation required, and then he looked away at the racks, the full, operating, producing racks, and said nothing else. She went back to her work. There was an evening in late August that she returned to afterward when she wanted to understand how things had changed. The summer had been hard in the practical ways. Long days, the expansion running at capacity, 6 customers, plus the ranch's own needs. Ruth now managing the accounts with a competence that freed Mabel to spend more time on the production side where her attention was most valuable. Cal essentially running the original chamber solo. Dex doing what Dex always did, which was everything that needed doing that no one else had thought of. And Harlan. Harlan had been the complication she'd expected to continue complicating. He'd done something surprising instead. He'd found his footing, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He'd simply, over the course of the winter and spring, stopped fighting the shape of things and started working within it. He managed the ranch hands with the same territorial instinct he'd always had. But the territory had been redefined, and after a long time of testing that redefinition, he seemed to have accepted it as permanent. He and Mabel were not close, and never would be. But he'd split the wood that long November night without being asked, and he'd moved his people efficiently to support her spring expansion without requiring it to be framed as her request rather than his decision, and she had chosen to receive that as the functional piece it was, rather than push it towards something it couldn't become. The evening in late August, she was sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the property, where the pasture ran to the tree line, looking at the mountains. The light was that specific late summer Montana light that turns everything gold and unreasonably beautiful, which she'd been trying to be more receptive to rather than always being somewhere else in her head while it happened around her. Rowan came and leaned on the fence next to her. He didn't say why he was there or where he'd been. He just leaned on the fence and looked at the mountains. They were quiet for a while. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She waited. "The way you described it in December, what you wanted out of this. The partnership, the work being actually yours." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand now what you meant by that in a way I didn't then." She looked at him. "What changed?" "I watched you build it," he said. "The smokehouse, the customers, Ruth, the whole thing. And I watched how you build things, which is differently from how I build things. And I think—" He stopped. He tried again. "I think I've spent 4 years trying to keep this ranch alive, and you've spent 8 months making it worth something. Those are different projects, and I should have understood that earlier." She thought about what to say and decided the truth was the right shape for this moment. "You kept it alive," she said. "I didn't have anything to work with if you hadn't kept it alive." He looked at her. "Is that you being generous?" "No," she said. "It's accurate. I don't do generous as a substitute for accurate." He was quiet. The light moved across the mountains, that gold deepening toward amber. "Mabel," he said. She looked at him and found him already looking at her with the expression she'd been cataloging since April, and had been honest enough with herself to know what it meant and uncertain enough about her own ground to not address directly. "I know this isn't—" He started and stopped. "I know the partnership has to stand on its own, separate from anything else. I know that. I'm not asking you to conflate them." "What are you asking?" she said. Carefully, but not coldly. There was a difference, and she was trying to keep her voice on the right side of it. "I'm asking if there's anything else you want," he said, "from this place, from beyond the business of it." She sat with that. She sat with it long enough that the light moved noticeably, the shadow of the tree line stretching toward them across the grass. "I want to not have this conversation until I'm certain the answer isn't going to change in a year," she said. "I've been certain of things in my life and been wrong. I'd rather be slow and right than fast and wrong." He absorbed this. "That's not a no." "It's not a no," she agreed. He nodded. He looked back at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. The horses in the pasture moved slowly in the late light, and the smokehouse stood solid and working at the edge of the yard with its iron pipe chimney, and the ranch was quiet in the specific way of a place that has found its productive rhythm. She was 26 years old, and she had arrived here 8 months ago with a worn bag and mud on her boots and a key she'd had to fight for. And this, the full racks and the 6 accounts, and the second ledger and Ruth Carey's careful handwriting in the account books, was what she'd made of the space that had been reluctantly given to her. Not what she'd been given. What she'd made. There was a version of this story where she was supposed to feel triumphant about that, supposed to feel the vindication of having proved everyone wrong. She didn't feel that particularly. What she felt was something quieter, the satisfaction of a person who did not need the people who had underestimated her to admit they'd been wrong, because the work existed independent of their opinion of it. The smoke still rose. The meat was still good. The ranch was still standing. What other people thought of the woman who'd done it was their own business, and it always had been. She thought about her father. She thought about what Rowan had said in January. You think he knew? She thought about the Kentucky smokehouse, empty and cold, and the decision to leave it, and the specific courage of moving towards something unknown when what you were leaving was the last place that felt like home. She had not been looking for a home when she came to Harlow Creek. She'd been looking for work that was hers, authority that was real, a place where what she knew was worth something. She'd found those things. The fact that the place had also become something she didn't want to leave was not something she'd planned, and she was still deciding what to make of the fact that unplanned things had turned out to be the ones that mattered most. I'm glad I stayed, she said. Not to Rowan specifically, not to the mountains, just to the air, to the honest fact of it. Rowan said, so am I. Quietly, and meaning it, and not requiring anything more from the moment than what it already was. The sun dropped behind the mountains, and the light changed from gold to the blue-gray of a Montana evening coming in. She climbed down from the fence rail. He straightened up from his lean. They walked back across the yard together, not talking, not needing to. And the smoke from the chimney pipe rose thin and steady into the cooling air, doing what it had been doing all winter and all spring, and into this summer, the visible evidence of a fire that had not gone out. She'd kept that fire alive. Through a night that would have broken most people, through weeks of being the person in the room everyone was waiting to fail. She had not failed, and she had not been heroic about not failing. She'd been tired and sometimes angry and occasionally uncertain, and she'd kept going anyway, which was the only definition of strength she'd ever trusted, the unglamorous one, the one that doesn't look like anything from the outside because it's just a person doing the next thing that needs doing and then the next one after that. Her father had that kind of strength. He'd never named it. He'd just had it, and he'd shown it to her through 22 years of doing the work right, and she'd taken it with her when she left because it was the most valuable thing he had to leave. She understood that now, standing in the yard of the Mercer Ranch in August, watching the smoke rise. She understood it in a way that didn't require him to have said it out loud. He'd shown her. That was its own language, and she'd spent 26 years learning to read it, and she finally had. The smokehouse door needed checking before dark. She checked it. The fire was good. The batches were holding. She latched the door against the evening and walked toward the lighted windows of the main house, and the sound her boots made on the dry summer ground was the sound of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had earned the right to be going there, and that was, she thought, enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was everything.